Okay, so greetings everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee of 100, and I'm also the chair of the Asian American Career Ceilings program that we have. And I'm very, very pleased today to have as my guest interviewee in this fireside chat, Bob Patel, someone I've known for a long, long time. And we're going to have a good session talking about his personal career background, but also his career progression in what is, I think it's fair to say, a relatively conservative industry. I guess that's probably fair to say, right, Bob? Right?
It is.
Yeah, a lot different than being in media with movies and all those sorts of things where things are a little bit different. So, but for those of you who are just joining, I just want to explain this is the 25th event in the last 3 years that the Committee 100 has hosted around this issue of the Asian American career ceilings, which is really a serious problem. If you look at how well Asian Americans do in this country relative to their population, you'll find something very interesting, which is they do very well getting into good schools. But when they get to middle management, things go awry, and you have a relatively few Asian Americans in the very top ranks in industry, in government, et cetera. Now, there are some exceptions, which we'll talk about, but basically that is generally the case. And so what we tried to do through these 24 sessions is really try to, one, bring leading experts who do research at Columbia or MIT and so forth on the issue and to find out what their research shows, to talk to people of different ages, millennials, CEOs, others, women, different combinations, to really try to illuminate the causes and the experiences and the lessons, probably more important, which is the lessons that these people can bring. Last, we started about a year and a half ago to shift towards action-oriented activities. So we had a session where we had 120 people get together, try to come up with new ideas to do things that were new or to improve what we're doing to tackle this problem. And I'm happy to say that many of those 25 ideas are being implemented today. So we're going to shift more and more towards action items. Now, the reason why, and last I want to say is we're using this platform AirMeet, and what we want to say is what's distinct about it is not this section, which is my interviewing Bob, but rather at the end, we'll switch into something called Fluid Space, where all of you essentially will be in a virtual cocktail session where you can walk around, talk to people, and decide who you want to talk to. And the interesting thing, using your arrow keys, you can move around. As you get closer to someone, their voice gets louder, and as you move away, their voice gets softer. So it's a little bit like in real life when you're meeting people in a reception. So hopefully some of you will join us afterwards. Bob graciously has agreed to stay on for a while in the fluid space. So if you have any really tough questions that I haven't asked, you can ask him during the networking fluid space. So Bob, I'm not going to repeat your bio because that's in the invitation, and I am assuming that our attendees all can read. But you had a very interesting history, and I'd like to start really by talking about how you first came to this country and immigrated with your mother and those early years, because I think that's an important part of the story of your own career and how you developed. And maybe if you could start by telling us when you first came to this country and what those experiences like, and then and then we could talk about then where you went from there in terms of education and career.
Well, first of all, Peter, thank you for having me and for always being so kind and saying such nice things about me. I appreciate that. Um, uh, Other thing I wanted to say before we really get into this discussion is that there are many immigrant stories out there, and I was telling someone at one time that my mother came here with $12, and I would say there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of those kinds of immigration stories where um, uh, a family moved here with very little. But what I assure you is that each experience is unique, and each family, each individual went through their own challenges, and there's nothing common about that. It may be common when people say they immigrate here with very little, but the path that they go on is anything but common. So my story, I immigrated here in 1976 with my mother, my grandmother, and my brother, my older brother. And we immigrated to Cleveland, Ohio, where we had family. So you have to remember, I came from Mumbai and had never seen snow in my life, never been on a plane until I was 10 years old, and we immigrated here. And we immigrated to a small town east of Cleveland, Ohio, in a town called Madison, Ohio. Now you have to remember in the 70s, um, there wasn't the focus on diversity that we find ourselves experiencing today, and it was more about blending in and less about embracing differences back then. And so what I remember was first just being fascinated with America and the wide open spaces. Saw snow for the first time. I will never forget that feeling of standing by the back patio door at my uncle's house and seeing this white flowery substance. It looked like flour, baking flour, falling from the sky, and I was just fascinated by it. Um, but I recall just wanting to fit in, but I always felt like I was so different than everybody else. And my name, Bob, so my given name is Bavish. And every time at school we had a substitute teacher, they would look at my name and they would pause because they couldn't pronounce it. There were many different ways people pronounced it. Often, there were jokes made about it, but it was my given name. And finally, it was shortened to Bob, which became Bob. Um, and while I'm very proud of my heritage, I kind of went along with Bob to fit in. And it was really about that in the mid 70s. It was about how do I fit in and not be different, so somehow I'm not um, viewed in a funny way.
Yeah. Well, Cleveland, boy, that is about as mainstream as you can get. I guess so. I guess you went to school, but you were already a certain age, right? So you had to acclimate to the American system and so forth. And how were you treated in school by your teachers and your classmates as in those early years?
I was treated as being very different, and people made fun of my accent. I had a very heavy British accent. I learned the Queen's English in Mumbai. Fortunate enough that my grandfather, um, although we were a very middle class sort of family, he spent money to send my brother and I to a private school in Mumbai. And so I had a very heavy Indian British accent. Um, and one of the memories I have is I remember, there was a spelling contest, and I spelled something with Z instead of Z, and I was disqualified because the teacher didn't recognize what Z was, and I was fuming because I was in the final three, and I got knocked out, and I went home saying to my mom, I said, "How does somebody not know that what Z is?" And so promptly my uncle said, "Well, in America you say Z, not Z." Um,
Hmm.
and at that time there were many TV characters. There was open sort of discrimination in TV shows. I mean, think about Archie Bunker back then, you know. Um, and there were Indian characters where they would exaggerate the Indian characteristics in cartoons and things like that. So, I constantly found myself just trying to fit in and not look different, but I was perhaps one of four or three kind of brown people in the grade that I was in. Um, and there weren't many Asians in general. Um, one African American in 5 grades, I think. So it was just all about how do I get through a day without somebody thinking I'm different and don't talk to me, make fun of me in some way, and how do I just sort of assimilate?
Yeah. It's interesting. My father immigrated to this country, and the three kids we were born in Virginia or Maryland, in D.C. And it was funny. We were the only three Asians in our school, the entire school from kindergarten to 12th grade, and we weren't discriminated. They all thought we were Martians. They didn't. They thought we were. So we had a kind of a really different, experience. Uh, but did you had any comparison? Like, did they treat you differently if you're Indian American, or for the few other Asian Americans? Do you feel that there was a difference in how they perceived you versus someone who was Chinese American or Japanese American, and so forth, or was it kind of the same?
I think, Peter, because of the color of our skin, we were sort of considered to be kind of darker people. And I'll tell you, when I first got my when I got my first job out of college, I worked for Eveready Battery Company for about a year and a half before I went to Chevron for 20 years. But I worked in North Carolina, in the center of North Carolina, in a town called Ashboro, and the KKK was very active there. This is in the late '80s, and I had one of the operators said to me, you're one of the dark people, and
Mhm.
he didn't distinguish between whether you're African American or if you're Indian or whatever. And so I think, in those days it was just kind of it was very it felt in your face many
Yeah.
times, and you were just treated differently. And I think at times you were expected to bow down, you were expected to be okay with not being part of the in crowd because you look different.
Yeah. Now, you ended up going to college and studying engineering and so forth. What was that transition like? Because
Well,
very different community, different kind of environment.
it was. I mean, I went to undergrad at Ohio State and I did chemical engineering. And of course, by then, there were more Indians, especially in a technical degree. There were more Asians, more people like me, I would say. Um, and so the assimilation got easier. And it was a more kind of diverse population, people from different parts of the country. Whereas when we first immigrated to this small town east of Cleveland, it was a very sort of insular, people didn't move out, not a lot of people moved in, and it was sort of monochromatic, if you will. College, I felt like there were more people like me there. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so that made it easier. However, I always tried to sort of assimilate in whatever environment I was in,
Yeah.
and adjust without sort of giving up who I am,
Yeah.
but always trying to adjust to the environment.
Now, it's very typical in Asian American families for the parents, the parents to have some very strong views about how you should succeed and what you should study. And whether you're Chinese American or Indian American or whatever, I think it's safe to say that there was a lot of emphasis in that generation. I guess the parents that you and I are about the same age, so our parents the same generation, to be a scientist or an engineer or be a doctor or something like. Did you face the same thing when you were from your parents, from your mother?
Absolutely. So there were two choices: you can become an engineer or you can be a doctor. And since we were kind of simple people with not the means to go to medical school, It was really about you have to be an engineer, you know. And so my uncle was a chemical engineer, my brother is a chemical engineer, and I'm a chemical engineer. Um, However, I wanted to do electrical engineering, and
Oh, wow, you were going to go wild, huh?
I was exactly so I was going to veer from the path, you know. Um, but it was the early days of sort of my business thinking that came out, because I couldn't. The electrical engineering program was full, and I would have to go for kind of an at-large acceptance into Ohio State for the electrical engineering program. And I thought about back then, well, when I graduate, there's going to be so many electrical engineers coming out, it may be hard to get a job. So maybe I go where there's less supply
Yeah,
and, hopefully good enough demand. And chemical engineering they were accepting engineering students immediately. You didn't
yeah,
have to go on a wait list. So I said, well, my uncle's a chemical engineer, my brother's a chemical engineer. The laws of supply and demand probably favor that I'll get a job. So sure, I'll be a chemical engineer. Why not?
yeah, that's right. Well, I have to say though, let's see, Cleveland, going to Ohio, and then Ohio State. Bob, you're about you picked as many mainstream things as you could. I'm not sure chemical engineering is mainstream, but certainly. So I won't ask you what your favorite football team is though, because
Well, you already know.
it's a good football team, right?
Most of the time. Most of the time.
Yeah. I won't say where I went to undergraduate, but my wife, who went to University of Michigan, that had a really good football team, she went to one football game at my alma mater and said a bad Texas high school football team could beat your team. And he said, "Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. So, I'm not going to disagree with you." So now you became a chemical engineer, and so forth. Did you go into industry right after that, or did you do something different?
No, I did. I went straight into industry. My first job out of college was with Eveready Battery in North Carolina. They
Hmm.
transferred me within 6 months, to back to Ohio, to Toledo, Ohio. Another kind of garden spot, Fremont, Ohio, actually. Um, and Peter, what I realized was that I just wasn't applying my chemical engineering education.
Hmm.
So I learned about a job at Chevron Chemical Company in Ohio. Again, still in Ohio. It
Hmm.
seemed like Ohio was part of my life for quite a while until I moved to Texas. But I joined Chevron Chemical Company back in March of 2010 after a year and a half at Eveready, so I could be a process and project engineer, and I could apply what I learned: thermodynamics, unit operations, heat exchanger design, all those things, which I love to this day.
Yeah. Now, Bob, part of the reason why, I mean, you and I have known each for a long, long time, which has been a pleasure. But part of the reason why I asked you to speak is that we've had speakers who are in different industries, telecom or media, whatever, which are not nearly as conservative as the chemical industry. I think the chemical industry is probably one of the most conservative industries you can find. But with that also comes, should we say, issues related to diversity, et cetera, right? I think they're kind of certainly not in the forefront in terms of helping minorities and women succeed. Uh, and then, so you were in that industry, and what did it feel like? And obviously, there were very few mentors because there was no one got to the top, so it was hard to get a mentor who was Indian American or Asian American, right? So, what does it feel like? And were there explicit things you did as you progressed up, uh, to counteract what I'm certain were issues related to ethnicity?
Yes, well, so first of all, when I was an engineer, I think it's what people would expect of an Indian American is, of course, they're engineers, and so it, it was what everyone thought it should be. But the moment I started to think about business jobs, I think then it became, well, about presence. And, I wasn't out of central casting as like a salesperson,
Right.
or later on to be CEO. I didn't look like the classic kind of, American CEO. And as I went through that, first of all, I always thought about um, showing up at my very best every time, attention to detail, ironed clothes, hair combed, always clean shaven. My shoes used to be shined. The guys at the plant would joke with me, and they'd say, you know, for an engineer, your shoes are always shined, and
Mhm.
I did them myself. And
Yeah.
it was my training when I was at that small private school in Mumbai that you had to have your uniform pressed and your shoes had to be shined. Um, Otherwise, you'd get a meter stick across the wrist, as punishment, sort of. Um, and I always, what I thought about is that I I want to do everything I can to present myself as well as possible, so that that doesn't become a barrier, and I'm judged based on what I bring, merit, um, my contributions, and I'm not judged because I'm not well dressed or because I'm not well groomed or somehow I wear things that stick out, or and aren't mainstream. So I always tried to show up as my best self,
Mhm, mhm.
and really paid attention to that, so that the judgment was about merit. It was about my work, not so much about my appearance.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, one of the things that's very noticeable about you, Bob, and you've done extremely well. You've been honored by, every industry association that I know of, and and but one of the things that's very clear about you is you do believe in being a decent person, decent to society, treating people well, and so forth. I think when people characterize the American management style, that's not necessarily the way they would describe it. They would describe it much more as aggressive and self-promoting and so forth. So I guess in a sense, you also had a second handicap, which is you weren't adopting the typical American
Yeah.
leadership style. Is that? I mean, I don't think you change your personality, because you just decided you were going to be a certain way. Was that a challenge, and to what extent do you think that was an issue along the way? Because as the old famous saying, which is nice guys always don't finish first, right?
Right. Well, so, I mean, I think part of Indian culture is to be dutiful. And, in our culture, much like the Chinese culture or other Asian cultures, you're taught to be obedient, to respect your elders, to respect people who have more authority, and generally, like speaking up and bringing your voice into the room where there are people who are either older or superior to you is not something you're taught. Especially my generation, who
Mhm.
grew up in the '60s and '70s, in my childhood years, we weren't taught that. Furthermore, one of the things and by the way, I'm blessed to have had my uncle in my life and my mom, who is a warrior to this day. She is just this driven, stubborn person, who came here with $12, and I think she changed the world in her own way. But um, they were both very service minded, and they both thought of others before they thought of themselves. And the values. I mean, I recall my uncle, at one point he was in the business. He was buying polyethylene when I was the business manager for polyethylene at Chevron Phillips, and we were theoretically selling to them, and we were negotiating contracts. And during contract negotiation season, he told me, he said, "We can't talk until the contract." So we used to talk every weekend. He was like a father to me.
Mhm.
But during the contract negotiation season, he said, we shouldn't talk to one another, even if it's just social, because we don't want there to be any appearance of you showing some sort of favoritism towards me or vice versa. We're always going to do what's right. And this doing things in the right way, this kind of service mindedness, humility, all those things, sometimes those characteristics cause you to be overlooked. And because you're in the background just getting things done, you're not the person who's raising your hand and saying, look what I've done. And I want to be noticed for this. I want to be recognized for it. I was not raised to walk in and say, I should have a promotion or I should be paid more. And that was not natural for me. Um, and so, all of that, all of those things are things that, it's a harder road, I would say.
Now, we talk about in big picture, the big picture, but in reality, a lot has to do with what company you're actually working, for. I
Yes.
know I mentor a lot of people, and in some cases, actually, they say, "Well, I have to change professions." And then the more we talk, the more I realize they just picked the wrong company within the profession, right? There wasn't a good fit with regard to their style or ethics. In your case, you spent most of your career at Chevron Phillips Chemicals and then on to Londo Brazil, and now you're with Grace and Standard, but most of your career was with those two companies. Do you feel that there was something about their culture or their method that was different from the mainstream that either helped or hurt you in terms of your success?
Well, I think the 10 years before the joint venture at Chevron was just such a big company. Um, but in some ways, I found that the values that Chevron put forth in terms of how they wanted to lead people and what was important. I identified with a lot of that. I think there was a lot about treating each other with respect and dignity. There was a lot of focus on rigor and being detail oriented. And so, but it was such a big company that you could get lost in the numbers. And especially being in the chemical business, which suffered for probably 9 out of the 10 years. It felt like a perpetual cycle that was
Yeah.
in a downturn, especially in the styrenics business, which is what I was, working in for most of that time. And then when the merger happened, it seemed like we became part of a smaller company, and that created a little more of this family sort of feeling. So I really have very fond sort of memories of both Chevron and the time at Chevron Phillips. But I think this sort of, I wasn't sort of the prototypical executive in how I appeared, how, as you said earlier, sort of um, I kept my head down a lot. It was about just getting things done, and hopefully somebody will notice and they'll give you a chance. And people did. Thankfully, you know, many of the leaders who I worked for, they took a chance on me. Um, but it took time. And, I had a boss when I was selling polystyrene before the Chevron and Phillips merger. He had three words that he used a lot when he coached me as a young salesperson. And he said, Bob, he said, life is a lot about patience, persistence, and perseverance, the three P's. And I've never forgotten that because I do think there's something to that. I think you have to be patient. Things don't happen overnight. And for some of us, we've got to work harder. And we have to be okay with that. And we have to be persistent. And we have to persevere, and I tell my kids this all the time that on one hand, yes, things take time, and perhaps because you're different, maybe it'll take a little longer, but don't ever give up. And when you get there, make sure that you look back and create opportunity for others.
Yeah.
Don't be the person who got there and forgot how you got there and who helped you get there.
Bob, over and over again in these webcasts that we have, probably one of the most frequently mentioned factor is having a mentor. And In your case, you were fortunate to have mentors, and I know at least one of them, who was your mentor, who wasn't Asian American, wasn't Indian American, so forth. How did that develop? I mean, if there's a lesson that you can give to the audience about how you develop mentors, what would be some of your lessons? And of course, the other is you also got to return the favor and be a mentor to others as well. But how did those? Was there or were there some philosophies that you had that help you develop these mentors? Because clearly, you had strong support from above.
I did, and it took time to earn that, and it took you know a lot of work, a lot of effort, contribution. In the Hindu culture, one of the things that we're taught in our religion is that you should do things without expecting things in return. It's this sort of notion of selflessness,
Hmm.
and I do think there's something to that. I think you do if you're at work and you say, you know what, tonight I'm going to work till 9 p.m. because I want to get this thing done, whatever it is that I've been asked to do. You do it because that's the work that you put forward and that's your contribution to the success of the company. You don't automatically say, well, if I work till 9 p.m. for 6 months, I'll get a 10% raise and a promotion next year. I think you do it because of the contribution. You do it because it's how you make a difference. And I'd say I was very persistent about that. And I don't recommend that you sort of become obsessed with your work, but when I was working on things, I mean, there were times where I didn't distinguish between a Saturday, a Sunday, or a Monday. It was just a day, and if I could work and get more done, I got it done, and I'm that way today.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think with some of the mentors, I think maybe I just wore them down. I don't know. And they just said, you know what, let's give Patel a chance
Hmm.
because he's not going away. And maybe he does some good work. But I think it's the persistence, the P of persistence. Just keep working at it. Show up as your best. Just don't leave, don't hold anything back. Leave it all on the field.
Yeah.
And every day. And I think it
And I guess
accumulates.
that, and I guess that that's appealing to people above you and colleagues and people who work for you too. I guess, right? By the way, my wife, I said to her, well, I think one of my positive traits is I've been persistent, and she said, I just want to remind you there's a thin line between stubbornness and persistence. And I think you're just stubborn.
I suppose we all have a little bit of that in us,
But
but I really think
I
this.
decided not to argue the point because I was going to lose, right?
You never argue with her, and you know she's smarter than you. So
Well, it happens to be true, so that's not something I have to think about. So you were lucky, so to have some mentors and so forth, and a big part though was your transition from Chevron Phillips to LyondellBasell, and part of that was company specific, right? What the needs were of the company at the time. Part of it was the person who was the CEO of
yeah,
Lyons Brazil who brought you over or whatever. Tell me about that dynamic, but also what do you think led to your being promoted ultimately to being CEO of LyondellBasell, which was really pretty amazing. I mean, LyondellBasell, for those of you who don't know, is one of the largest chemical companies in the world, and makes a lot of the stuff that people either love or hate, depending upon whether they're chemical engineers, right?
indeed. Well, so first of all, Peter, I would say that early in my career, soon after I joined Chevron, I really committed to getting foundational experience. So when you think about LyondellBasell, CPChem, Grace, Standard, industrial companies, we do two fundamental things. We produce product safely, reliably, cost efficiently with the best quality, and we sell product in a way in which we can get the best value for the product. And I decided very early on that I wanted to have, at the ground level, been a part of producing and selling.
Mhm.
Um, and I wanted to have walked in those shoes, not just a year or two to tick the box, for a
Mhm.
long enough period of time to have learned, made decisions, and lived with my decisions, and learned from that cycle, if you will, of what happened with the kinds of things that I worked on. And so, I would say that foundational knowledge, while it took time, and there were times where my peers who were becoming experts in engineering or what have you, they were being promoted. Often I was moving laterally to get this broader set of experience. And that was really, really important. And that's where the P of patience really paid off, is I was patient. And the competitive side of me said, well, how come others are getting promoted and I'm having to move laterally when ultimately I'll be more valuable by knowing all of these different things, right? But it required patience, and you had to have faith a little bit. And along the way, show up as your best every day. Don't leave anything back. Leave it all on the field.
Yeah.
Um, and then when I decided to move to Lyondell Basell, first of all, I had been with Chevron for 20 years, and I'd like to think that I had great runway there, and perhaps to be CEO there. And so I was really leaving something that had a level of certainty and a level of comfort, frankly, because I grew up there and I knew the people, knew the business, knew the assets. Um, and when it was a very scary time when we, and I always say we because my wife and I and my family, we decided together that we would take this risk. And without the support of my wife moving all over the world and my kids doing all of that, I couldn't do what I couldn't be where I am. We did it together, but it was a scary time and it was risk. And so often when I've had job changes, I've thought about two things. Um, I always think about, first, can I contribute? Can I make it better? And the second thing I think about is, will I learn something? And and at that time, when I contemplated, when Jim approached me about joining LyondellBasell, I knew I could contribute because he was asking me to run the olefins and polyolefins business in the Americas, and I had run the individual pieces, polyethylene, olefins. I knew feedstocks, so I thought I could contribute. What I would learn is learn from Jim and learn how to restructure, how to lift a company out of bankruptcy, and do it with this pace that was just incredible. It was a sprint every day, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So dealing with uncertainty, and there was no guarantee that I was going to become the CEO, down the road. But I went in knowing I could make it better, and that I would work hard to make it better, and that I knew I would learn something that I wouldn't learn if I just took the easier path of staying where I was.
Now,
Um,
do you feel during your career, at those two companies, were there any points where you felt there was clearly racism or discrimination against you? I certainly felt that way. I've had a very successful career in strategy consulting, investment banking, but I have to be honest. There are times where, uh, I really felt that that certain assignments are going to people who weren't Asian American, right? And separate from being stationed in Shanghai or Tokyo, right, which is a different matter, right? Do you feel that there was any discrimination along the way? It's certainly an industry that's not known for being progressive.
well, I felt that some, and I think part of it was my age, part of it was my heritage. I would say it was not overt, but yes, there were times where kind of the older white person got the job, you know, that I thought I was very qualified for. But Peter, through that, I would say never once was I bitter about it. Never once did I expect something for that, like I was owed something. I always thought about whatever job I get, I want to get it based on merit. Uh,
Mhm.
and now, as I think about as a leader, how to help people, the helping people, and I do a lot of mentoring with people that are out of college, mid-level managers, many who are minorities. And I always tell them, like, double down on effort. Don't ever feel you're owed something, and look for opportunity. Like, all you want is a shot. And so when I think about how I the diversity lens as a leader, I think about opportunity, and I think we have to provide equality of opportunity to learn, to develop, equality of opportunity to compete for roles. The outcomes are generally based on merit.
Mhm.
But if you don't have opportunity, then you don't have outcome. And I think that's what's important is the sort of looking back and paying it forward now is really about creating opportunity and to see beyond sort of the the heritage of a person, the way they talk, um, the way they look, and really get to the substance and help people put their best foot forward. So it's really, to me, what's important to me is opportunity, and I
Yeah.
think there should be equality of opportunity.
I'm going to flip the issue around and refer back to we had a number of speakers, particularly researchers, talk about the research they do, where they went below just the Asian American definition. They looked at the difference between the success of Chinese Americans and Indian Americans and Japanese Americans, et cetera. And the research shows, and even anecdotally, it's clear that Indian Americans stand out as clearly doing better than the South Asians rather than East Asians
Mhm.
in at least the U.S. Business environment. If you look at the CEOs of major companies, particularly in technology,
Yeah.
you've got CEO of Microsoft, of Google, until recently Mastercard, so forth. It's an unbelievable number of Indian American CEOs, far greater in proportion than the population. And the researchers had some very interesting theories as to why. It isn't because you look white, because no, because Indian Americans do look white, and it isn't because they always speak better English, because that's not necessarily
No.
true. But they did cite two things. One is a certain kind of aggressiveness, not in a negative way, but the other is that Indian Americans do a better job of working together to try to succeed professionally, versus other, kinds of things. I mean, Chinese are much more just purely family oriented, the help relatives, so forth. They're less likely to reach out and help someone who's Chinese American who's not a family member. Do you feel these two, what I said, do you feel is true? And do you agree or disagree with those two factors that it's a professor at Columbia and MIT that it did joint research and that was part of their conclusion?
No, I think it's hard to generalize, but I think I've seen some of what you described, and I think we're all sort of we're all a product of our upbringing and sort of our heritage, in a way. And different cultures emphasize different things, and I think for me, it was really about sort of being service minded and humble and just kind of work hard and have faith. It's this sort of notion that our version of the Bible teaches us, which is do things without expecting something in return. And I know that sounds a bit ideological, and in real life, you could be taken advantage of if you always thought that way. But I think if you start with that, and if you're still looked over or passed over, then you may raise your hand and say, hey, enough. Like, why am I not getting the chance? you don't want to lead with that.
Yeah.
And I think it's the patience. It's sort of have a bit of faith. And if at some point your turn never comes, to your point earlier, Peter, maybe you're just at the wrong place.
Yeah. That's right.
And it can be that certain companies executives look for people who look like them, you know, and that's just how things go.
Yeah.
Um, but I think you have to be patient, and I think in today's world we have to be careful not to quickly get to the conclusion that I didn't get that because of I'm Indian or Chinese or whatever. But if there's a pattern, don't disregard the pattern.
Yeah. Well, I also think that an important element, which we haven't really emphasized, is it's really important to know yourself, because whether you're Indian American, Chinese American, Caucasian, whatever, we all have some different personalities and styles and so forth, and interests, right? What we like or don't like. Do you like working in teams? Do you have a long attention span or not? Well, if you don't have a long attention span, good luck being a professor, right? Because no
Yeah.
one can write a book in 2 weeks, right? So I think a lot of it is knowing yourself and then matching yourself up with the companies and professions and say, is that a good match? And that actually goes well beyond the issue of race, right? Because it doesn't matter whether you're Asian American or African American. If you have certain personality traits and needs, if you make the mistake of going into industry where it isn't a good match, you're not going to be successful.
No
So,
matter who you are. Yes.
what advice? What advice would you give? So, if you've got 2 minutes and you've got a whole group of people like we have today, what advice, what would be the takeaway for you, your advice that you would give in terms of how to succeed in this country as a, and as an Asian American?
Well, I think it's the introspection, as you said. It's knowing who you are and who you're not. Knowing what motivates you. Why does it motivate you? It's the easy answer is I just want to progress. I want to be promoted every 3 years, and if all goes well in 20 years I'll be CEO. But why is that? Why do you want that? Other than title and wealth and whatever, I think knowing purpose and knowing who you are, and knowing your strengths and weaknesses, and some things are just innate. Like you're not going to be able to change certain things. Some things you will learn and become better at as you mature,
Mhm.
whether they're personal traits. Some things can evolve over time. Some things are innate, and knowing that about yourself is really super important. And I think if you're humble enough to sort of be introspective, and you want to make whatever it is better, you will realize your potential, whatever that is. You'll realize it.
Yeah.
Don't be single-mindedly focused on I have to get to the top. The top could be something different for you. Think about the top as the top of your potential and the impact that that potential has. That's what's important.
Yeah, no, that's right. One of the things we just can't ignore is the fact that we're in a very bad environment of Asia hate, and so forth. And, the people who are involved with doing unfortunate things towards Asian Americans, they don't, and a lot of it is exacerbated by the tension between China and the US. And a lot of these people who are, misbehave, they don't make a distinction between whether you're, Filipino or Indian American, Chinese American. And so, do you perceive that, at least the data shows that it's worse and that racism is worse, et cetera? Do you perceive that? And and how would you somehow connect that with this issue about how to succeed in U.S. business?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to just rise above it and not take it personally. And it exists, and there are times where there's more and times where there's less. But I think that's when you double down on being of the highest character, rising above it, be the kind of the bigger person. I'll give you an example. In During the Gulf War back in the early '90s, I was based in Southeast Ohio, and I was meeting some other young engineers out for a drink and shoot pool on a Friday night. And we went to this bar. I was a little late because we had a problem at the plant, and I wanted to stay there to follow through. And so I was the last one to arrive. I go to the bar, and the guy wouldn't. So there was a person at the bar, a patron, who looked at the bartender and said, "You're not going to serve his kind, are you?" And I ignored it. I stood there. I was hoping the guy would bring me my beer. I could pay him, and I could move on. And this guy then proceeds to raise his voice and says again, "You're not going to serve him, are you?" And so I looked at this person, this guy, and I said, "Sir, what kind do you think I am?" And he said, "You're one of those guys from Iraq." Um, in the moment, you kind of just, it gets you down. You might take it personally, but it wasn't. It's just he didn't know any different, and he was coming at it from his own perspective and had some sort of bias or hatred. And so I just said, well, I said, first of all, I'm Indian. I'm not Iraqi.
Yeah.
And I said, not all Iraqi people are bad. Okay. So, however, I looked at the bartender and I said, you know what? Maybe I just don't need a drink today. I'm good. And I'm fine. And I looked at him and I said, hope you have a good day. The other guy who said, don't serve him, and moved on. I mean, you just rise above it. You show your character. And in that moment, maybe I wasn't a bad Iraqi after all, if that's what he thought I was.
I had a similar story. When I was fixing chemical and pharmaceutical companies when I was at Bain and Company, and I got an assignment to fix a fertilizer business. And by the way, Bob, my opinion of you has been altered by the fact that you love styrene, which has got to be the worst commodity chemical company on the planet.
I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yeah, but fertilizer is right in the same league. And I remember I had to go down and interview the guru of fertilizer, who was the guy down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So
Hmm.
we flew in, stayed at a motel, got in our rental car, and I asked the guy at the front desk. I was here with two of my colleagues. I said, "Where's the best barbecue place?" And he said, "Oh, Big Bob's Barbecue just down the street, a couple blocks down." So we went down. Now, what he didn't tell us is the one thing you shouldn't do is go into Big Bob's Barbecue wearing a coat and tie, right? So we should have figured out. We pulled into the parking lot and all these pickup trucks with gun racks, right? We should have figured it out by then, but we walked in, and that old ad where they said E.F. Hutton, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone, and nobody's tired. We walked in the door, the thing was packed. It went totally silent, right? And we looked around, and there were all these people in jeans and cowboy boots and everything else. And I made a decision. I said I was either going to turn around and walk out, or I was just going to walk up to the bar and ask for a beer. So I decided, what the hell? So I walked up to the bar, asked for a beer, and the guy who was at the bar, he said, "I'm going to buy this guy a drink. Any guy who is brave enough to come into Big Bob's Barbecue looking like this, I'm
Right.
going to buy him a drink." And then I got like 5 drinks from people there. So you sort of have to decide when to stand down, right, and when to just sort of say, "Guys, I don't agree with you," and so that's that, right?
But I think you never take it personally, and you never think you're owed something for it. You just kind of have to double down on character contribution, making it better, and that wins the day over time. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah, that's right. Um, so, but I also think you're very lucky that not only did you pursue a career in a profession which matched you personally, but it also matched your family. If you had a different wife with a different priority, it would
Yes.
have been a different story. It would have been a big mistake, right? If you married someone who just said, "Look, I don't want to move, I want to stay in one place," then it wouldn't have worked.
Well, there's just so many things that I'm thankful for. Certainly, family and my uncle who sponsored us to come to America back in 1976. I always say to people, when somebody says America this or that, I always say it's the best country on earth, and it's a privilege to be able to live here. And no matter what happens, no matter what somebody says to you on any given day, I think it's a privilege to be here, to be in a country that offers so much opportunity, like America, and and I think you sort of follow your destiny a little bit, and there's lots of people who help and sponsor and support along the way, and at
And,
some point you turn around and you look back and say, now it's my turn to
yeah,
help and sponsor and make it right for others.
yeah. And that's why a lot of people say, well, gee, you're running an investment bank and doing all these things. Why do you think it's important to spend your time doing these kinds of programs and so forth? I said, well, at some point, you got to figure out how to give back, right? At some point, because when you pass away, you don't want someone to say, "Well, gee, he was a great investment banker," and that's it, right? Now I'm going to ask people in the audience before we shift everyone into the floating fluid space. If anyone has a question that they want, please type it into the chat box. I think Bob, you can see the chat box. I
I
think.
can, I
Yeah.
can.
If anyone has any questions for Bob, please type them in. Okay, there are none. So either you did really well or did. Oh, where we go. Okay, well, you just got a thank you here. All right, well,
Well,
that's good. So Bob, it's like when there are no questions, either means you did a great job or a terrible job.
exactly. I'm not sure which it is. The critic in me probably says I did a terrible job.
Yeah. Now, what we're gonna do? Oh, here it's one question. Okay, do you see it, Bob?
What is next in your career for you? Well, I've been an operating company CEO for almost 9 years, and as of April, I've moved up to the holding company here at Standard, where I'll have other CEOs reporting to me, and honestly, like the next part of my career is just about helping others be successful, um, and give a hand to lift people up. Um, and it's not that I know everything, that I've done everything, but I have a set of experiences. And if even one thing I say can help somebody, then I'm fulfilled by that. Um, and it's really, I think about that now is about this is like this is the legacy part. Frankly, is people get to places and they accomplish a lot, but ultimately the impact you have on others is far more important, and that's what I hope to achieve in whatever this next phase of my career is, and to help build something here at Standard.
Yeah. And uh, okay, here's a question from Eugene Lee. Just says, no opportunities, no outcomes. Agreed. Bob, in your career, have you always been able to get good supervisors who led you and provide opportunities for you?
I've had both. I've had some who only thought about themselves, and I've had some who provided opportunity. Um, and those times where I had supervisors who no matter what I did, it went unrecognized. It never stopped me from working hard, from putting my best foot forward. Don't let other people change your faith. Don't let other people change your values. Those things should be constant. And I assure you that over time, you will be given the opportunity to realize your potential, whatever that is. Don't be daunted when you end up with that one supervisor who is not a good supervisor, who doesn't help you, who doesn't recognize you. There will be others who do just the opposite. And that everyone makes you stronger and better for different reasons.
Now, Cindy's side has a really good question, and it's a good question for old folks like us, Bob. I'm glad you mentioned about combing your hair properly because you and I are losing the battle. Yeah,
Exactly.
I seem to have less hair to comb.
Me too.
So, question is, do you think bias, discrimination, etc., is different today? Was different in the '70s, which is sort of our era when we we're growing up, principally from a perspective back then. Uh, was there more ignorance than there is today? Certainly things have changed, right? I mean,
Yeah,
today, right? What do you think the differences are?
I think I'm gonna take the positive approach on this, which is that I think today there is more recognition, acceptance, and welcoming of differences because of this kind of dialogue. We talk about it. Long time ago, you just didn't talk about these things because it was awkward, because it felt strange, because we just don't talk about it. And I think today there's more awareness. But there will always be some amount of discrimination. I don't think you can ever do away with it because somebody's going to have some bias. But I think that the business environment today um, embraces differences more than ever, and it's our job as leaders to make that environment even more so. And those of us who um, are provided opportunity from that embracing of the differences, make the most of it, and don't ever think you're entitled to it.
Yeah.
Make the most of it. Make it so that people say, oh, beyond sort of, Bob being Indian, he does really great work, and that's why we want him to do this next.
Yeah.
And so, embrace that, make the most of it.
I think one big difference is the battle then in the 70s was a different battle than today. I think the battle in the 70s, today everyone takes for granted that Asian Americans do really well getting into good schools. I mean, Harvard, 16%, I guess, are Asian Americans that entered, so forth. But that battle is over. But the battle, it's a different battle today, right, than before. When I was applying for college, the college I went to accepted exactly 15 Asian Americans every year for 10 years. So finally, someone pointed out and said, "Wait a minute, it can't be that exactly 15 people were qualified, each year." And this is all Asian Americans, including the Asians, rather, whether they were American citizens or not. And they dropped the quota, and the numbers went up. So I think we're going on to different battles as each generation, goes by. The last question here before we go into fluid space. This is a good one. I always like comments about engineers, right? I have a soft spot, and my wife says I'm a closet engineer, and I think she means it as a compliment. I'm not sure.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, that's right. It says, what are some of the differences between an engineering mentality and a business mentality? So that's a good question.
That's a great question. I'll tell you what kind of comes to mind. So, engineers, we're known to be analytical. We're known to be sort of logical. We're rigorous. We're detail oriented. Um, we think that kind of the facts are the facts, and they should be, obvious to everybody. And it's kind of like it's about an equation, and it's logic, right? I think business people, they engineers who are business people, they take that sort of rigor and analytical, and they apply that to ambiguous situations, things that aren't as clear, um, things that aren't formulaic. They apply judgment. They think through risks and opportunities. They think through what's the worst that can happen, what's the best this could be, and think about risk reward. And this is a big thing these days. I think is that we all have to get better at dealing with a certain level of ambiguity. And for engineers, I think we have a harder time with that because we think that everything is kind of an equation, and there's certainty to an equation. But when you apply logic and rigor to deal with ambiguity, I think some real magic happens because then you take risk and you take informed risk. Um, and when you have disappointment, you learn from it and you get better and you commit to not making the same mistakes again. But I think that's the difference between maybe business and engineering. Um,
And I would make a
very
broader
helpful.
point too that's relevant to this issue about career ceilings, and that is the cultural mentality is to focus on EQ, IQ rather, and not on EQ. And I know that was true in my family. They study hard, learn the books and everything else. Less on EQ and how to understand politics, understand people, and listen. And I do think that's one thing, and it's kind of embedded in your answer about engineers versus business mentality, because a big part of that is spend a lot of time thinking of as much about EQ as IQ, because the reality is that's how a lot of the world works, right?
I agree. And if you want to make an equation out of it, I would argue that success may be that EQ is greater than IQ,
Yeah.
especially as a leader. But certainly, if you're strong in both, you can.
You're really going to do well. So we're going to end because we have gone over the regular time, but for good reason. And we're going to go into the fluid space before. So I'm going to remind you that we're going to end this session, and then each of you who wants to go into the fluid space, just click on fluid space when you get to the lounge. Bob, you're going to go from the backstage back to the to the lounge. And then use your arrow keys to walk around and bug people that you want to bug. There are two other things I just want to mention. One is our next Asian American Career Ceilings program is on June 14th, where we're going to have the next generation team that is under the Committee 100 present this video they did about Asian American Career Ceilings. It's very, very good that they produce as part of a project. And then at the end of on June 26th, I believe, we're going to have executives from 3 different ethnicities. Chinese American, Japanese American, Indian American, who've been successful, but try to talk about the differences that they see that drive success by ethnicity. So with that. Bob, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to see you in the fluid space, but I'm going to thank you for taking your time to do this. And I'll remind everyone, I'm going to move all of you. I'm going to move Bob back to the backstage, and then he can move to the lounge. And all of you should go to the fluid space, and we'll see you there.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.